slight change of pace now. David was very modest really about his achievements before, because having been on pilgrimage with him a few times, you will appreciate the way we did, what a beautiful voice he has, how much we enjoy his beautiful voice. His voice is so lovely that when we sat often 4 across the front of the bus so that David and I could use the microphone easily, it would be David and his wife Tureti and John and me. And it was really no time at all on the bus from when David started speaking beautifully that he would look to one side and Tureti would be going like this, and he would look to the other side and John would be going like this.
What happens on pilgrimage day? I will see you in bed tonight.
Am I saying true words, David? I am indeed. So I'm certainly hoping that I won't have that effect on you now. And I haven't got any jokes to tell. And in fact, there's an awful lot about St Clare that's not jokey at all. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, just talk to you about Clare's life and how she came to be on this Franciscan journey, on this gospel journey. And then I'm going to talk to you about 4 things about Clare which I think we can take today from her life. And then finally I'm going to go back to the slide of the San Damiano cross and talk about Franciscan prayer and practice something of Franciscan prayer and what it might mean for you personally. All right, so that's kind of what I'm going to do over this next time. And if I finish a little early, I'm sure we can cope with, but I may not. So I want you to imagine waking one Monday morning and finding that your 17-year-old daughter has not slept in her own bed. Okay? You go in there and there is a note from her to say that she has run away. She's left home, that she loves you, but that she cannot live with you or be part of the life that you live anymore. Already it's quite hard to imagine that. But she tells you, or you are pretty sure, that not only has she left your home, but that she has gone off with somebody that you're very aware about because he's been around town for a while. And he hangs out with another whole raggle-taggle bunch of guys, not in the town, but down a wee way away from town. He's 28, 29, she's 17. So that's pretty awful. So you go down and see if you can hunt this girl out. Sure enough, you send a whole pack of male relatives to hunt her out, bring her back before the news gets out, because actually none of us wants to be part of that kind of family scandal, all right? We want to be able to avoid that if at all possible. So down they go. They do find her. It's exactly as they thought. She's gone off with this guy, and they say, well, she's not here with us anymore. She's actually gone to a convent up the road. She's actually safe. She's gone to a convent up the road. You go to the convent up the road. The abbess of the convent is a little bit anxious about all of this happening, so she takes the male relatives to find the girl, and she actually would be quite happy for this girl to be taken home too, because it's all a bit hot to handle. The girl who knows that the relatives are after her runs into the chapel of this little monastery, up to the altar, grabs the altar cloth, because the convention is that if you're seeking sanctuary, there you are safe. And she flings back the hood on the old cloak that she's wearing, and they see that her hair has been cut. She's been tonsured. And basically what she says is, she holds onto the altar cloth, I'm not coming with you. They try and persuade her, they try every means. She's not going back. And that is how Clare of Assisi burst on the scene at the age of 17. She was born in the late 12th century to an aristocratic family, the eldest of 3 daughters, by all accounts very beautiful, very charming, very sweet-natured. From a young age, very connected to God, a spirit that always was open to God, and a spirit that was always open to the needs of others. So it's well recorded that as a young girl in an aristocratic household, she would often save food from the table and make sure that it was distributed to the poor. It's also told that as a teenager, she started wearing a hair shirt underneath her aristocratic clothing. So this idea of bodily penance was actually something that came quite naturally to her. So anyway, here we have Clare, 800 years ago, leaving home. It must have been the talk of the town. It was certainly very uncomfortable for the abbess of the Benedictine convent that she was taken to by Francis and the brothers. Clare, it seems, had probably started hearing Francis preaching from the age of about 13 or 14, and it seems very likely that she was very interested in the gospel message that he was giving. And it was very much straight from the Gospel of Matthew, which was go on the road with no sandals, no money, no staff, just go as you are and preach the good news of Jesus. It seems as though she probably arranged to have secret meetings with Francis. And it seemed as though there were often other people present. Certainly, her family would not have had any knowledge of her interest in Francis. And the big question that sits around all of this and that we find ourselves asking is, was she in love with him? Was he in love with her? And what kind of romantic relationship was there? We'll never know that. We do believe that there was certainly a very strong love connection, and at the time that Clare fled her home, she was probably expecting to be a little like the women on the road with Jesus. That she would be part of the group that could support the men who were doing much of the begging, particularly because the critical thing around how Francis and the brothers lived in the world was that they owned nothing. They were totally dependent on God and on the provision of people round about them. So it seems that when Clare did go, she was probably expecting that was the kind of life she would lead. It didn't work out to be like that. So, first of all, she was taken to this Benedictine convent. Now, she had thought of a vocation, a calling to be a gospel bearer, for a long time, but she knew that she was not attracted by being in a Benedictine convent. The Benedictines were quite wealthy. They certainly relied on women from wealthy families who would bring their dowry with them, if you like. Now, when Clare was taken to this Benedictine convent, she had already renounced all her worldly goods. She brought nothing with her. So she was dependent on those women rather than being somebody who would support in practical ways the well-being of that convent. Not only that, because her family were an aristocratic family, the abbess was very concerned about the influence of the family, and that it may not be beneficial for their monastery to have Clare in there for very long. So she was soon moved on to another place, which may have been another Benedictine convent, or it may have been a group of women who were what were called penitents, but were not under a particular authority or rule. So whatever. She didn't last there for long, because Francis had this vision that San Damiano, which he was rebuilding, was going to be a place where women could be. And Clare's coming on the scene certainly solved a problem for him, because his gospel vision was so compelling, was so attractive, he was so charismatic, that it wasn't only men who were joining him to be brothers, but there were many women who also caught on to this vision. And it was a problem for Francis. What do we do with these women? And in many ways, Clare solved that for him, because she had the strength of character that he could see that she could be the leader, the person who could really draw these women into community in the same way that he had been able to draw the brothers into community. Saint Ignatius wrote this: "There are very few people who realise what God would make of them if they abandoned themselves into his hands and let themselves be formed by his grace." I'll say that again. There are very few people who realise what God would make of them if they abandoned themselves into his hands and let themselves be formed by his grace. Hold that for a moment and think of that in terms of your own life. Think of it in terms, I will do the same for me. Ask the question, how much have I been prepared to abandon myself and my life into God's hands? How much have I been open to God forming me by his grace rather than by my own efforts or imaginings or desires? So what I would say of Clare is that she is one such person. Hers was a life of total abandonment into God's hands and a complete willingness to be formed and reformed and transformed by his grace alone. I think one of the miracles for me, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that at the beginning of the 13th century, in this small hillside town, these two remarkable young people, these two lives intersected with so much explosive and creative energy that 800 years since we are still seeing and experiencing the power of that. Clare was actually born in 1194, and her mother was something of an adventurer herself, or Tolana, which means gardener, or Tolana. And sometimes the symbolism of that, the gardener who grew this plant that was Clare. And when she was expecting Clare, she had a dream. In the later stages of her pregnancy, she was praying for reassurance about the safe delivery of her child. We know that in those times, having children was a very dangerous occupation. She was visited by God in a dream. He told her that her child would be the bearer of his light to the world. So she dreamt that. And when their baby daughter was born, she was named Chiara, or Clare, and that means light. Thomas Celano, who was one of Francis's biographers, wrote of Clare that she was Clare by name, brighter in life, and brightest by character. And in fact, we love the name Clare so much, Chiara, that we have even named our new schnoodle puppy Chiara. So, as I mentioned earlier, she was a very spiritual child, but as the daughter of a wealthy aristocrat, her life trajectory was pretty much laid out for her. She was destined for a grand marriage that would strengthen her family's property and resources, and from quite a young age it seems as though there was quite a procession of young men trailed in front of her, none of whom she showed any interest in at all. And in fact, there was tales of one suitor who came to visit Clare, and it seemed as though she preached to him the whole time about care for the poor. She wasn't interested at all in his fine words. And so what we find is Clare being more and more engaged with the vision of gospel life that Francis is holding out, and that she then starts to see the brothers experiencing down below the town of the city of Assisi on the hill, down in the lower area. And in those days, where one lived was, of course, very representative of one's status. So Clare, from an aristocratic family, lived in the upper reaches of Assisi. Francis around the middle communal area. As you got further down on the city towards where the basilica was built, then you had the poorer classes. A lot of that was to do with sanitation in those days, because things travelled downhill. And I'm sure that if you were uphill, it was a whole lot nicer. So Francis, when we see him rejecting his father, leaving the city through the gates, was going down onto the plains, which were quite swamp-like in those days, and that was the place where you found communities of people with leprosy and others who were poor and in need, and that was where he and the brothers made their home, and that was where Clare headed with them. The day that she left, or the night that she left, was the evening of Palm Sunday, so a very significant time of the year. She had attended the Palm Sunday service with her parents in the cathedral. She was well known to the bishop, the Bishop Guido, who later became Pope, and when she was at San Damiano in charge there and he was the Pope, they had many interactions. So if she lived now, she would be the sort of person who would set social media buzzing. She certainly would have had a large friends list and lots of contacts. She certainly knew how to connect with people. But on that particular Palm Sunday, where the convention was that the bishop would hand out palms to people in the congregation, and then the palms would be laid out in memory and in recognition of laying things out before Jesus entering Jerusalem. She became so overcome at that point that she couldn't go forward and receive her palm, and she was obviously weeping in the pews. And the bishop himself came down to her and gave her her palm. And that's been interpreted by many scholars over the years as an understanding that the bishop had been confided in by Francis, that Francis knew Clare was going to, that the bishop knew that Clare was going to leave home and join Francis, and that he gave his tacit approval. And that also he was part of the process of finding a safe place for Clare to go when she had left. So anyway, that was their Palm Sunday. Clare, knowing that this would be the last time she would worship in church with her family, and certainly not unaware of the impact that her actions were going to have, particularly on her family. So there we have Clare. What I've written here is we can't overemphasise the radical nature of Clare's actions and the barriers that she needed to overcome to do this. First of all, she needed to be able to break out of the family home overnight. And those of you who've been to Assisi will have seen the death doors, the outline of the door now all blocked in with stones. The convention then was that when somebody died, their body was not taken out through the regular entrance exit way, but that the death door was unsealed and the body would be removed and then resealed. So that was probably closed with a very, very heavy bolt, which would have been hard work, I think, for a teenage girl. So first of all, she had to get out of the home. Then she had to get out of the city. And we've seen the gates in the photos today, but in those days, the gates were closed and the doors were pretty formidable doors, and there would have been a guard on them. So somehow Clare would have had to have been able to arrange to be let out through the gates. She needed at least one trustworthy female relative or friend who could go with her. And then she needed to make her way in the darkness down off the hill. So the actual physical getting out wouldn't have been easy. So there was Clare now, first in one convent, into another, and then 2 weeks later, her sister Catherine made the same escape from home and joined her. So, David, you talked about not perfect families. I think there was certainly some sleepless nights. We know these 2-3 o'clock in the morning worries over family. I certainly think her mother and father experienced a fair amount of that. And as a parent, I have a little bit of sympathy for them. So anyway, when Clare's sister left, Clare was overjoyed that Catherine had joined her. She was in her cell when once again the uncle, who must have been thinking, what is it with that? The uncle was sent out with a whole pack of male relatives to get Agnes. And this becomes the scene of the first reported Clare miracle, which was Clare in her cell hearing her sister call to her as the uncles physically restrained her and got her ready to take away. It seems like they were incredibly rough with her. Clare prayed in her cell, and Agnes, Catherine, renamed Agnes by Francis, Catherine became so heavy that the relatives could not move her. And so the uncle, who was absolutely incensed by this stage, lifted his arm to hit her and found that he could not bring his arm down to do that. And again, the men abandoned it. There was obviously no way that they were going to get this girl safely back. Interestingly, after Clare's father died, her mother joined them at San Damiano, and her third sister also joined them. So there was certainly something about Clare that made people want to be with her and were captured by her vision. So she lived out the remaining 40 years of her life in San Damiano. And this is a real turning point for me in the story of Clare, because as I've read about her and thought about her, I really do believe that that was not what she expected. I don't think she expected that she was going to be cloistered for all those years. 3 years after forming the community at San Damiano, Francis finally persuaded her to become the abbess, the spiritual head of that group. She had fought that because she had an egalitarian spirit. So again, this is something that came from within her, which is really incredibly contemporary. You know, this aristocratic young woman who saw the beauty and the value in everyone else and didn't believe in someone having hierarchical power over them. So what was life and community like for Clare? Thomas of Celano, I'll read a little bit. He was drawing on the first-hand accounts of Clare's contemporary. For long periods after Compline, which was the final service of the day, Clare would pray with the sisters, and after the others had gone to their hard couches to rest their tired limbs, she would remain watchful and unwearied in prayer, that while sleep lay hold of the others, she might by stealth, as it were, catch a whisper of God. And as I think about those words, I imagine maybe if Clare had been in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus, maybe she would have been the one who stayed awake. Another poor Clare wrote, in these early years, Clare is learning that what attracts the divine lover most. So this idea of Jesus as the divine lover, all right, all the love that she had was focused on him, is not eloquent prayer but tongue-tied helplessness, not elaborate rituals but mute poverty, not a wealth of words but silent emptiness. To her helplessness, to our helplessness, to her poverty and our poverty, to her emptiness and our emptiness, the great and good Lord will bow down. The incarnation is the ultimate statement of that. Not us going to God, God coming to us. He himself will cross the abyss to meet us. Just ploughing on a little bit. One of the things I think about Clare is that her life was like a living beatitude. So she actually embodied the beatitude. She was pure in heart and she saw God. She was poor in spirit and she built the kingdom of God around her. But there was more. Here's a lovely one. Here are some of the things. Her miracles were most often associated with prayer and the signing of the cross, the instantaneous healing of 5 sisters who were ill, a small boy whose life was in danger after he had put a stone up his nose. Can we identify with those sort of little boys? I certainly can. Of a friar with a mental illness who had been sent to her by Francis for healing. Carol Lee Flinders, who's a poor Clare, wrote, "The deficit Clare carved out of her own creaturely needs became an unfathomably vast fund out of which she could give." So in denying herself, she built this rich resource which she was able to share with others. Another one of those amazing spiritual paradoxes. She gave food, for she was credited with more than one feeding miracle. She gave health, for she is said to have healed a remarkable variety of ailments of body, mind, and soul. She gave safety and peace, for she protected her convent from invading mercenary troops on more than one occasion. And I'll come back to that in a while. But the final thing about Clare was that she survived Francis by 30 odd years. I forget the actual numbers. If people do the maths and their little timelines there, they'll be able to work it out. And what is absolutely key about her was that she held the true Franciscan vision through that time. Francis had died. The politics of the Franciscan order, books have been written about over the centuries. But Clare held firm to the rule of poverty. And what we have here is two systems at war. We have a medieval understanding of women and what they're capable of, and a belief by the Pope, who was responsible for giving the rule, that women could not be held to the same level of poverty that Francis had been allowed to live by. And so the Pope was always trying to pull back from Clare, claw back the immensity of the poverty. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, Gregory the Ninth. So she knew all the popes, and they certainly knew her. Gregory the Ninth offered to absolve her of the vow of poverty that she had made before Francis. Clare's response was immediate. "Holy Father, absolve me from my sins, but not the vow to follow our Lord." There was not much he could do about that. On another occasion, the Pope decreed that it was improper for a Franciscan brother to live with the poor ladies, as they were called, as their spiritual advisor. Again, Clare's response was instant. Yes, she would accept the Pope's ruling on the assumption that the withdrawal of spiritual nourishment for the sisters also implied that physical nourishment was unimportant. And she put herself, not the sisters, but herself, onto an immediate hunger strike. Interestingly, the Pope backed down immediately. I think that probably gives us a little hint as to the character of this woman, that popes tried to decree, and if Clare didn't agree, they would back off. Jerry Straub, who wrote the lovely book there, The Sun and Moon Over Assisi, he sums it up like this. In everything that did not infringe upon the essential nature and character of the Franciscan life, Clare gracefully submitted to the will of the pontiffs. So basically, if she agreed with what they were asking her to do, and if it was consistent with what it meant to be a Franciscan, then she would graciously agree. If it didn't, they had a battle on their hands. And that battle went on until 2 days before her death, when finally her rule was approved. And it seems, as David mentioned, she was very unwell. I imagine some sort of arthritic condition. She was bedridden for a long time. But even in that bedridden place over all those years, she was a confidant, she was an advisor, she was visited, she wrote letters, people wrote to her. And finally, 2 days before her death, the rule was approved, with Franciscan poverty being a central part of that rule. The word is that the Pope got the message that Clare really was ready to die, but she wasn't going to until he had agreed. So I guess what I'd say is, never try and cross a firm woman, all right?
Amen.
So I think there are 4 things that come through for me from Clare. Certainly her faith, all right? The light of Clare's life was Jesus, and her faith was continually nourished by her focus on him. So like Francis, when we follow in her footsteps, we are following behind and with Jesus. Secondly, the theme of sacrifice. It's not something that we look forward to or welcome, but actually somewhere in most or all of our lives, there is sacrifice involved somewhere. What I've written here again, when Clare left her family home in 1212, she was expecting to subvert the restrictions that were placed on her life as a young aristocratic woman. She was expecting to have a similar life to the life of women who followed Jesus and the disciples, and to be able to minister on the front line. But increasingly, modern scholarship suggests that being cloistered was completely opposite to what Clare's dreams would be. And what I think is, it's a little bit like the equivalent of being under house arrest or on home detention for 46 years. The next thing is that of courage, and I want to talk just a little about when San Damiano, which is outside the walls, so unprotected by the normal protections that were offered to people within the city, was attacked by mercenaries who had been employed by the Holy Roman Emperor. And I alluded earlier to the fact that there was this tussle between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. And the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor who was wanting to claw back Assisi and bring it back to being one of his towns as opposed to a papal town, had employed mercenaries, Saracens. So I presume that means that they were Muslim and that they were to come in and terrorise San Damiano and work their way up into the town. And so you can imagine Clare, with the responsibility for all these sisters who were in her care, very ill and quite bedridden, realised that she needed to do something. So she was helped from her bed. She asked the Franciscan priest friar who lived with them to get the communion host where it was in its, I forget what's it called, David? Well, the monstrance, or the pyx it's sometimes called, isn't it? So the container for the consecrated communion bread, the body of Christ, and it was taken. She went outside the convent walls where these men were threatening to attack. She held the monstrance high and prayed that she and the sisters would be kept safe and that Jesus would protect them. And for those mercenaries to be so confronted with the most sacred symbol of the faith, not only of Clare and the sisters and the townspeople of Assisi, but actually also, and this is a point you made to us, David, also the person who had employed them, the Holy Roman Emperor, they backed off. And the interesting thing that we take from that is just how intelligent and strategic Clare was. So not only did she have this courage, but she also was incredibly strategic and political in her outlook. And she used that gift not for her personal advantage, but to promote the gospel, the Franciscan spirit of following Jesus as closely as possible in their way of life. So one of the things that what I'd like to do now is actually focus back on the San Damiano cross. I think I can get my see if I can bring this all back to life. Okay, I don't think I can go back and find that. What I want to do is talk about the San Damiano cross, and I want you to hold the thought in your mind. It might be that John is able to retrieve it there. He's wonderful. But Franciscan prayer actually turns on its head what we might, if we take the Benedictine, I'm just looking through my notes here. That's all right. There's one in either. Either one of them would be fine, John. Oh no, it's up the top in the Franciscan ones. If you flick up through there. So basically, Franciscan prayer turned the notion of prayer and the way in which we do things on its head. So Benedictine prayer, if we're looking at Lectio Divina, is that, and some of you will be familiar with that, is that we move upwards towards God. Franciscan prayer is again about God coming to us. And so we have here in the San Damiano cross this wonderful image of Christ alive, all right? Christ dressed not in the garments that he wore when he was crucified, but in a priestly garment. And although you can't see it in this image, there is God's hand reaching down. And so one of the things about Franciscan prayer is that by gazing on this crucified and resurrected Christ, we find in there the mirror for our lives. So that mirror is not that we become Christ himself, but that by looking into that mirror, we see something of the image of who each of us are individually created to be. So there are 4 words that Clare used when she wrote to Agnes of Prague. And she wrote 4 pastoral letters, if you like, and in one of them she used 4 words: gaze. So the first thing is that we just gaze on that image. We be with Christ. We be with Jesus there. We don't try and do anything. And then we consider in more depth. We start to think about, what does it really mean? What does all of that living and being with us and dying and then reclaiming his divine life, what does it really all mean? So we gaze, we consider, then we contemplate. which we might think sounds like consider. But actually, contemplate is allowing God to speak back to us. It's God praying in us, if you like. What might God want to be saying to me? And then the final thing is imitate. And we see in Francis and Clare's lives that they have imitated Christ as closely as they could in the way that they lived, in the way that they cared for the poor, in the way that they shared the trappings of what it meant to be human. But imitate is not that I become another Jesus. It's actually that in imitating him, I become me. I become Jenny. I find who I am created to be. So I'd like us just in these 5 minutes to focus on that cross, focus on that image. We may do it with our eyes, or we may actually do it inwardly. Take a few moments to gaze and just be with Jesus in that place. Then consider what this means. What is the significance? And then contemplate, open to what God might be wanting to say to you at this moment. And finally, imitate when you look into the mirror of what is before you. Who shines back to you as Bob or Sue or John or Elsa or whoever. Okay, gaze, consider, contemplate, imitate. Thank you. just in your own time, when you're ready, there is a cup of tea out there, some afternoon tea.